We have come to worship in this holy space together. We chase out evil thoughts for good, to share a vision of a world of happiness and peace, to understand the need for toleration, love, and respect, to reaffirm our common humanity. Welcome.
Our reading this morning is entitled Socrates and the Socratic Paradox by Maiden. Socrates is philosophy's martyr. Sentenced to death in 399 BC Athens for corrupting the minds of youth, Socrates never wrote anything down. We know of his era-defining thinking only through the writings of his contemporaries, particularly his student Plato. Plato's Socratic dialogues. Some of the most wonderful works in the history of philosophy feature Socrates in lively conversation on a wide range of subjects, from justice and virtue to art and politics. The central theme in Socrates' thinking, however, concerned the nature of knowledge, specifically how none of us really have any. As a statement often attributed to Socrates puts it, true wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life, ourselves, and the world around us. During Socrates' life, the Oracle of Delphi proclaimed him the wisest of all people. Socrates, regularly declaring absolute ignorance as he did, could not agree. He therefore set out on a quest to find someone wiser to prove the oracle wrong. Ruffling the influential features with the Socratic method. Socrates approached influential Athenians considered wise by the people of the day, statesmen, poets, and teachers. He conversed with these individuals using what is now known as the Socratic method, a form of argumentative dialogue that uses incisive questioning to stimulate critical thinking and draw out presuppositions. And if I can just make a little aside, this is widely used in medical training, certainly was when I trained. Toward the end of my career, some people felt it was a bit rough. By using his method of bottomless questioning, Socrates soon discovered that, in fact, nobody really knew anything about anything, be it on art, ethics, politics, justice, the self, or the true nature of the world around us. He thus concludes, as reported in Plato's Apology, that the Oracle of Delphi may have been right in her judgment of his wisdom. For my part, as I went away, I reasoned with regard to myself. I am wiser than this human being, for probably neither of us knows anything noble or good, but he supposes he knows something when he does not know, while I, just as I do not even suppose that I do. I am likely to be a little bit wiser than he in this very thing, that whatever I do not know, I do not even suppose to know. In other words, Socrates believes himself to be wiser than those he speaks to because, unlike them, he admits his ignorance. This thought is encapsulated by the paradoxical statement, I know that I know nothing. Socrates, known as the Socratic Paradox, this phrase is not one that Socrates is recorded as saying, but thought to be derived from the passage in Plato's Apology as outlined above. Regardless, it's a significant statement for epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge. Socrates' discussions over 2,000 years set in motion the profound doubting, the uncertainty as to what we can know. the uncertainty as to whether the foundations for human knowledge ultimately rest on anything other than tradition and custom. That came to the fore with 17th century philosopher René Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum.
In this pulpit, preaching to people in the pews, I doubt anyone remembers my sermon from Christmas Eve, but it was about looking forward to what this year has in store for us. And coming back to in-person worship and church life and meetings was one of the things I mentioned. And today marks the beginning of some of those predictions coming true. I suppose the most important things that need to be said about the next 3 weeks of hybrid services is that they are an experiment, which means something very specific. As in science, the goal of an experiment is to collect data, to try something new based on a hypothesis and see what happens. And using that data, we don't necessarily have answers as often as we just get better at asking better questions for the next experiment. And that's really what today is all about. We're trying something new. I've been telling the board and some other lay leaders as we were getting ready for today that there are two possible outcomes to these experiments. One is that everything will go exactly as it is planned, and we will know what we want and what we are capable of. And the other possibility is that it will fail miserably, or parts of it will fail miserably, and we will learn even more what we want and what we're capable of. If it fails, we learn even more. Plus, I don't know about you, but when I fail at something, I want to do it again until I get it right. And I know a little something about failure. One of my favorite games to play with my friends in college was share your most embarrassing moment. And for many years, the story I'm about to tell you was my most embarrassing moment. I have since matured since this time. I don't even think it cracks my top 10 anymore in terms of embarrassing moments. But I suppose it's still kind of up there. This takes place when I think I was a senior in high school. And there was this state competition called the Citizen Bee or something like that. It was a little bit like a spelling bee, only instead of spelling, they asked you questions, sort of like trivia questions on history or geography or social studies. And those were and still are my favorite subjects. And they chose two of us from our high school to kind of represent our school at this Citizen Bee. And as one might expect, the questions at the very beginning are very easy and they build up to become harder and harder as the competition goes on. I was eliminated very early. I think it was my second question, who did Lee surrender to? And instead of saying the obvious answer, which is Ulysses S. Grant, I don't know, maybe I was just a little too loyal to the home state guy who was born just one county over from me. And I said George Custer. Yeah, see, laugh at me. This is why it's my most embarrassing moment for so long. Perhaps, so the general who died at Little Bighorn was obviously the wrong answer, and I went home on what is ridiculously easy question. To add insult to injury, the other student from my high school made it all the way to the final two, came in second in the competition. Not a great experience, I have to say. I hate being wrong. It's a thing with me. So that's probably why I was so embarrassed in my strongest subjects by that Citizen Bee that I'm sure everyone else who competed in this thing long ago has forgotten the experience. But as I was telling a friend of mine recently who just became a UU minister, something magical happens when you become a Unitarian Universalist minister. And the magical thing is this: nothing bad ever happens to you ever again. Because from then on, Once you become a Unitarian Universalist minister, you can divide your life into two categories. There are only good things, and there are sermon illustrations. And so all of those negative experiences kind of get transformed, if you will. And so the story of failing at the Citizen Bee, not a bad thing, absolutely not. It just became a sermon illustration. So those are very, very valuable to me. As Alanis Morissette reminds us in her song, You Learn, she sings, you live, you learn. You love, you learn. You cry, you learn. You lose, you learn. You bleed, you learn. You scream, you learn. And then at the end of the song, she adds a couple more to the list. You grieve, you learn. You choke, you learn. You laugh, you learn. You choose, you learn. You pray, you learn. You ask, you learn. You live, you learn. I like the one about choking. Well, what did I learn from that experience? Well, I think it was the first step, by no means the last, in learning that difficult lesson that there is life after being wrong. Having the wrong answer to a question or in a debate is not the end of the world. In fact, being right all of the time can become a little annoying to some people. Sometimes it's better to be in relationship rather than proving to everyone how right you are about everything. Some spiritual lessons can emerge from our own failures if, as the Bible says over and over again, we have ears to hear. This was brought home to me once during one of my first board retreats. I was serving the Unitarian Church in Wilmington, Delaware, and the church in Wilmington was making a transition to what's known as policy governance. It's a governance style some churches use, particularly larger churches. Comes from the nonprofit world, and my predecessor in Wilmington had hated this form of running the church and left really in no small part because of he couldn't or wouldn't adapt to policy governance. I was new to it, but wanted to learn about policy governance, so they called me to be their minister. Now, it's a complicated setup, policy governance. I'm not going to get into the whole thing with us today, but suffice it to say, it defines some new roles for what the minister does and what the board does in this congregation. There's different ways in which reporting is done and monitoring has to happen on a regular basis, and it's kind of a complex dance that's not really as intuitive as one might first like, particularly in the beginning. Policy governance wasn't even around when I was in seminary, so I was learning on the job. I made a bunch of mistakes my first year. Fortunately, the board president there, really, and the board in general, was pretty knowledgeable and pretty forgiving of me. So by the time my second year rolled around, we had all pretty much gotten the basics down, but there was still a lot to understand about how to make things happen on kind of a day-to-day basis. So that my second board retreat, I was talking to a member of the board, this was sort of, one of those breakout sessions where we're just kind of informally chatting. And I quasi-apologized for all of the times I'd messed up policy governance in the past year. I'd never forget, though, what his response was. He said, "Oh, we still make mistakes. We just know more now than we used to. Now we're making mistakes at a whole new level." That statement was a little transformative for me. It isn't that we ever stop making mistakes. Just make sure your mistake happens at a higher level than they used to occur. The goal is not to get the answer perfectly right all the time. That will never happen. The goal is to make better mistakes, to get better and better so that your mistakes and your failures are happening at a higher level of skill and insight, which leads directly to greater understanding. The goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to fail upward. Because failure, mistakes, messing up, regrets, shame, errors, they all hold spiritual lessons for us. Not knowing how life will turn out is a big part of the adventure. If we could perfectly predict the future all of the time, life would become immensely boring. Not knowing and learning is what life is about, which is why Socrates is such an intriguing figure. As we heard in our reading today, the oracle at Delphi declared that Socrates was the wisest man alive. He doubted it. He would show that he was not the wisest. He'd talk to people around town, find someone's got to be wiser than him. But when he did, he found kind of a curious thing. Whenever he would best someone in one of these debates or discussions, they had a hard time admitting defeat. No one wanted to admit that there was a limit to their knowledge. No one wanted to be proven wrong. And instead of admitting that they had been bested, they stubbornly and steadfastly would adhere to their original position, even if it had been shown to be factually untrue or unwise. Sound like anyone we may know who was a public figure until recently? Well, eventually, eventually Socrates came to the conclusion that, well, maybe I am the wisest of us all because I kind of understand that there's a limit to knowledge. Not because he knew more than other people, but because he held on to wisdom and truth so deeply that he would rather the truth be served than his own ego stroked by being right. Socrates would gladly admit that he was wrong if someone proved him to be wrong, because he knew that by being wrong, his pride might be slightly wounded, but the truth would be revealed. Everyone would become wiser, including, and most especially himself. So, in an odd sense, being wrong made him wiser than being right. Humility is a spiritual gift. I dare say Unitarian Universalists are rather averse to learning. We want to be on the winning side. We want to assume that the way we think something will go will actually conform to our ideas and expectations. I'm sure that there are some, when you heard about this pilot hybrid thing, thought, no way, we can't do it. Why not just wait until the fall? We can all be back in person in worship. It's impossible with the technology we have and the volunteer hours of a small congregation. Those are all assumptions. Those are all stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of. They're not necessarily wrong or even unreasonable, but all those statements are to me just hypotheses. They're assumptions that need to be tested by experimentation. Now, I'm no scientist, of course, but I think the scientific method has something going for it here. Built into that scientific method is what we might call a kind of Socratic humility. Rather than assuming, for example, that the sun revolves around the earth, Galileo had a different idea. What if it's the other way around? What if the earth goes around the sun? So he set out to test that assumption with an experiment, and that experiment yielded data. And he used that data to refine and perhaps replace those previous assumptions. In other words, he was starting to fail upward, making mistakes at higher and higher levels by asking better and better questions. Yet assumptions was constantly testing those assumptions. He wanted actual data about how the world is, not stories someone had told him or stories he was telling himself. That takes some humility, right? It takes some desire for the truth, even at the expense of one's ego and the expense of one's worldview. For Galileo's experiments would not only prove the earth went around the sun, but it upended all the assumptions, all the stories, everything that the church had been telling us since the days of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Galileo literally changed how we saw the world and our place in it by asking better questions and his willingness to fail at answering them. Because more important than him being right was that the truth would be revealed. I wanted to be right at that Citizen P. What I got instead was the truth. Truth about who I am and what I'm capable of. And that I can bounce back when I need to. Which is to say that everything up until now has been kind of a roundabout way of answering the question on everyone's mind coming into this Sunday, why the heck are we doing all this? Well, my answer to that question is, we don't know who we are and what we're capable of. Not fully anyway. Sure, there are things that we can't pull off. There's limits. Jane and I gave serious consideration to having some sort of in-person RE during these 3 Sundays, and the board even allowed for that possibility. Jane was talking to some of our RE families in addition to the survey that went out, and we talked about it and looked at the issue from all sides. And in the end, we realized we just didn't have the resources, the collective will to have in-person RE that was both safe, inclusive, and effective as religious education. Is that failure? Well, maybe from one point of view, it might seem that way. If you define success by the accomplishment or non-accomplishment of a particular program. But I think in this case, that's an overly simplistic measure. Now, I see it as a success because we learned who we are. We learned what we want and what we're capable of doing. Acknowledging our limitations is not failure, but realism. It's the same humility that Socrates had when he set his ego aside in order to learn the truth. We had to set aside our personal desire to have or not have RE and instead follow what we can actually do. We don't know what we can actually do until we have that conversation. Do a little visioning. Give it a shot. RE may not be possible, but coffee hour is. We do it outside. Membership committee had some really interesting debates over that. And instead of just giving up, or assuming that it would be easy, they instead took a very clear-eyed assessment of our resources and shaped a vision for a coffee hour that we think that will be actually pretty rad when we have it here in a second. Which brings us to the last part of our experiment about hybrid in-person worship. No experiment works unless you collect data. So we need data to learn about this experiment we're doing. So worship committee and I are going to be asking you after these 3 weeks are done to give us some feedback. We want to know what your actual experience was of these 3 weeks. Not what you thought it might be possible or how there is no way that it could have worked out. We don't want to make those kinds of assumptions. We rely on the stories that we tell ourselves. We want to be open to what actually occurred in the hearts and minds of the members and friends who experience these 3 Sundays. And that includes people who participate virtually as well as in person. We only learn when we hear from you. So keep your eyes peeled, keep your mouse clicking fingers at the ready. Your answer can help us as we learn what the congregation wants and can more confidently lead it into the future. Lastly, I want to close with a story you may have heard before. It's about an executive at IBM who worked in the financial office in some capacity. Not entirely sure what his mistake was, but the upshot of it all was that this guy made an error that resulted in IBM losing $6 million. In one stroke, $6 million gone. Following day, this particular executive gets called into the CEO's office. Fellow is cowering. He is, as he heads into his boss's office. And the CEO starts talking about investment strategies going forward in a very sort of informational and collegial tone. And finally, towards the end of the meeting, this executive says, "So wait, you aren't going to fire me?" And the CEO says, "Fire you? No way. IBM just spent $6 million on your education." $6 million on an education. That's a big mistake. But even that isn't the end, right? We can still fail upward. May we be blessed in our efforts to do so, no matter where they might leave us. Thank you for being a part of it. May our quest for the truth never falter or deter us. I love you. Go in peace. Amen. The Spirit that brings us together sustains us as well throughout the week, providing us with the strength to meet the challenges of each day, allowing us to contribute to the well-being of others, lessening their pain and increasing the joy and the happiness in this world. Amen.